My brother sent me one text before disappearing. If Dad comes home, hide. So I hid. I called Ethan immediately, straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. Again. Nothing. By the sixth call, I was pacing our kitchen. Ethan wasn't the type to ignore people. He especially wasn't the type to send cryptic texts. My brother was painfully logical, annoyingly responsible, the kind of guy who replied to emails within 3 minutes. So if Ethan texted me to hide, something was very wrong. I texted back, "What happened?" No response. "Where are you?" Nothing. At 9:07 p.m., headlights swept across the driveway. Dad's truck. I stared at Ethan's message. If Dad comes home, hide. Every part of me wanted to ignore it. Instead, I climbed into the cramped space behind the upstairs linen closet, a hiding spot Ethan and I had used as kids. 30 seconds later, Dad walked in. "Ryan?" I stayed silent. Dad called my name again. Then I heard something impossible. A second voice. A woman. "Did you find him?" she whispered. Dad answered immediately. "No. But Ethan knows." My heart nearly stopped. "We need to leave tonight," the woman said. "I know." A floorboard creaked beneath me. Silence. Then footsteps started upstairs. Fast. I held my breath. Dad stopped directly outside the closet. "Ryan," he said quietly, "if you're hiding, don't come out. Not yet." Then the footsteps moved away. I stayed hidden until after midnight. When I finally climbed out, both Dad and the woman were gone. Sitting on the kitchen counter was a photo of Ethan outside an unfamiliar house. Written on the back, "He found him." The next morning, Ethan was officially reported missing. Everyone expected me to fall apart. Instead, I became suspicious. Dad started acting strange almost immediately. He installed cameras around the house. He stopped going to work. He began checking my phone every night. He tracked my location. He forbade me from entering his office. He even removed the lock from my bedroom door. When I asked why, he gave the same answer every time. "I'm trying to keep you safe." Safe from what? 3 days after Ethan disappeared, I searched his room. Hidden beneath the false bottom of his desk was a flash drive. It contained dozens of recordings. The first one sounded ridiculous. Followed Dad again, met same woman, possible affair. Then, woman identified as Claire Harper. Harper. The name meant nothing to me, until recording 12. Claire isn't Dad's girlfriend. She's connected to Daniel Harper. The name sent chills through me. Daniel Harper. A man Mom refused to discuss. A man Dad never mentioned. A man whose framed photograph had quietly disappeared from our house years earlier. I kept listening. I found bank records. Dad has been sending Claire money every month for 19 years. Another recording. Dad lied. Daniel Harper isn't dead. Then, I think Dad's hiding something much bigger. The final recording had been made the day Ethan vanished. His voice shook. "I confronted Dad tonight." Long pause. "Dad admitted Daniel found us." My stomach dropped. "If anything happens to me, don't trust Aunt Susan." The recording ended. I immediately drove to Aunt Susan's house. When I mentioned Daniel Harper, she nearly dropped her coffee mug. "You need to stop looking," she said. "Why?" "Because your father has spent 20 years making sure Daniel never finds you." I stared at her. "What does that mean?" Susan looked terrified. "I've already said too much." She practically forced me out. That night, Dad searched my room. Again. I confronted him. "What are you looking for?" "Ethan's notes." "Why?" "Because if Daniel gets them, people could die." It was the first time I'd ever seen genuine fear in my father's eyes. The next morning, Dad's office was locked. Naturally, I broke in. Inside, I found hundreds of documents, court records, old photographs, financial statements, and one envelope labeled Ryan. Inside was my birth certificate. Father, Daniel Harper. I stopped breathing. Everything suddenly made sense. Why Dad had always seemed distant. Why Mom never talked about Daniel. Why everyone lied. Dad wasn't protecting me. Dad was protecting himself. I packed a bag. I was halfway downstairs when Dad walked in. He saw the suitcase. Then he saw the birth certificate. The look on his face shattered me. "Ryan," he whispered, "don't. You lied to me my entire life." "I know. You aren't my father." Dad looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. "No," he said quietly. "I raised you." I walked out. That night, I received an email scheduled by Ethan. If you're reading this, I disappeared on purpose. I nearly dropped my phone. "I found Daniel." At first, I thought Dad had hurt him. I was wrong. Dad helped me disappear because Daniel found our address. I froze. Ryan, Dad isn't the person you should fear. Attached was an address. I went the next morning. It was a storage unit. Inside was the truth. Photographs of me, hundreds of them, age 6, age 10, age 14, graduation, work, school, my bedroom window. Somebody had been watching me my entire life. At the bottom of the box was a final note. Daniel took these. I threw up in the parking lot. That evening, an unknown number texted me. I'd like to finally meet my son. Attached was a recent picture of me entering the storage facility. I ran home. Dad was waiting. I finally told him everything. For the first time in my life, Dad told me the truth. 21 years earlier, Mom had left Daniel after discovering massive financial fraud and increasingly controlling behavior. Daniel vanished before he could be arrested. Years later, he secretly began contacting family members, watching us, following us, waiting. When Ethan accidentally found him, Daniel became obsessed with reconnecting. Dad helped Ethan disappear because Daniel had started asking questions about me. Questions only family should know. I wanted to believe Dad. Then Ethan called. Alive. Ryan, he said, crying. He's coming. Who? Silence. Then, Daniel! An hour later, the garage door was spray painted. I want my son back. Dad immediately moved us to an old lake house. That's where everything ended, because Daniel found us anyway. Seeing him for the first time was surreal. He looked normal, kind even, until he started talking. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask about my life. He only talked about what had been taken from him. My son. My family. My future. Not once did he ask what I wanted. That's when I understood. Daniel didn't miss me. He missed ownership. The biggest twist came when Ethan finally revealed why he disappeared. Daniel had approached him months earlier. At first, Ethan thought Daniel was a victim. Then Daniel asked Ethan for copies of our house keys, school schedules, work schedules, information about me. That's when Ethan ran. Dad helped him disappear. Together they staged Ethan's disappearance to lure Daniel away from me. The text suddenly made sense. If Dad comes home, hide. Because Ethan knew Dad had gone to confront Daniel. And if Dad came home unexpectedly, it meant one thing. Daniel already knew where I was. Daniel was arrested shortly after the confrontation at the lake house. The fraud charges never disappeared. Neither did the evidence of years of stalking. Mom and Dad finally told me everything. Every lie. Every mistake. Every ugly truth. Ethan eventually moved away. Dad and I spent months rebuilding trust. We're still working on it. Last Thanksgiving, Ethan and I sat on the back porch long after everyone else went to bed. I asked him if he regretted disappearing. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "Leaving was the only way I knew to keep you alive." And honestly, I still don't know what's scarier. The fact that he was right. Or the fact that Dad knew it before either of us did. After Ethan told me he and Dad had staged his disappearance, I couldn't speak. I just sat there in the lake house kitchen staring at both of them. Dad looked exhausted. Ethan looked guilty. And I felt stupid. For weeks, I'd been convinced Dad was the villain. I'd searched his office, gone through his things, accused him of lying, walked out on him. Meanwhile, he'd been sleeping on couches, moving Ethan between safe locations, and trying to keep Daniel from finding me. "Why didn't you just tell me?" I finally asked. Dad let out a tired laugh. "Would you have believed me?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. Because no, I wouldn't have. Not after finding the birth certificate, not after all the secrecy, not after hearing him whispering with Claire. "Who even is Claire?" I asked. Dad and Ethan exchanged a look. "Daniel's ex-wife," Dad said. I frowned. Ex-wife? Daniel remarried after he disappeared. Claire left him 6 years later. That surprised me. "Why was she helping you?" "Because Daniel started watching her children too," Dad said quietly. "She was afraid of him." I didn't know what to say. Suddenly, headlights appeared through the front window. Everyone froze. Dad immediately stood. "Ethan," he said calmly, "take Ryan upstairs." "What?" I said. "Now." Ethan grabbed my arm. "No! Ryan! No more hiding!" Dad looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Fine." He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick envelope. "If anything happens tonight, you give this to the FBI." I stared at it. "What is it?" "Everything." Before I could ask another question, someone knocked. 3 slow knocks. Nobody moved. Another 3 knocks. Dad walked to the door. "Thomas," a man's voice called from outside. "We need to talk." "Daniel." Dad looked back at us, then opened the door. Daniel stood on the porch alone. No weapon, no anger, just sadness. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Daniel looked directly at me. Ryan. Hearing him say my name made my skin crawl. I didn't come here to fight, he said. Dad didn't move aside. What do you want? Daniel looked exhausted. I want the truth. Ethan laughed bitterly. That's rich. Daniel ignored him. Instead, he looked at me. Your mother never told you what really happened, did she? Dad immediately stepped forward. Don't. Daniel sighed. Thomas, he's an adult. What truth? I asked. Nobody answered. I looked at Mom. She had gone completely pale. Mom? Tears filled her eyes. Oh, God. Dad closed his eyes, and suddenly I knew. Whatever this was, it was bad. Really bad. Mom sat down slowly. Ryan, she whispered, there's something I've hidden from everyone. Even Dad looked confused. What are you talking about? He asked. Mom started crying. Then she looked at Ethan. I'm so sorry. The room went silent. Ethan, she said, Daniel isn't your biological father. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Mom looked at Dad. Neither are you. Dad stared at her. What? I looked at Ethan. He looked as shocked as I felt. Mom covered her face. The affair wasn't with Thomas. Dad took a step backward. Emily. I lied, she sobbed. To everyone. The room felt like it was collapsing. Mom looked at Daniel. You were gone so much. We were struggling. I made a mistake. Daniel stared at her. No. I never told anyone because I was afraid. Dad looked sick. Ethan, Mom whispered. Your biological father was Richard Lawson. The name meant nothing to me, but it clearly meant something to Daniel, because all the color drained from his face. Oh my God, he whispered. Dad looked between them. Who is Richard Lawson? Daniel laughed. It was the saddest sound I'd ever heard. My former business partner. Silence. Then Daniel said something that changed everything. The man who stole millions from our company. I felt dizzy. Daniel looked at Ethan. The man federal investigators believed was me. Nobody spoke. Mom nodded slowly. I found out after you disappeared. Dad sat down heavily. So all these years? Mom nodded through tears. Daniel wasn't running from investigators. Daniel looked completely broken. He was running from Richard. Suddenly every piece fit. The fraud, the disappearance, the fake identities, the paranoia. Daniel hadn't vanished to escape justice. He'd vanished because the real criminal had framed him, and Richard Lawson had disappeared too. Ethan looked horrified. Where is he now? Nobody answered. Then Dad slowly looked toward the window. So did Daniel. Outside, parked across the road beneath the trees, sat a dark SUV. With its headlights off, watching the house, Daniel whispered 3 words. He's finally here. Nobody in the room moved. We all stared through the window at the dark SUV parked across the road. The engine wasn't running. The headlights were off. It just sat there, watching. How long has it been there? Dad asked quietly. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Long enough. Ethan swore under his breath. Mom looked like she was about to faint. I was still trying to process the fact that Ethan apparently had a completely different biological father, and now there was another man involved. A man who had supposedly stolen millions, framed Daniel, and disappeared 20 years ago. Nothing about my life made sense anymore. Dad turned to Daniel. You're sure? Daniel nodded slowly. I'd recognize that vehicle anywhere. Who is he? I asked. Daniel looked at me. Richard Lawson was my business partner. We started Harper Construction together right out of college. The guy Mom had an affair with, Ethan said flatly. Mom looked down. Daniel continued. Richard was charismatic. People trusted him immediately. Investors loved him. So did I. He laughed bitterly. Big mistake. What did he do? I asked. Daniel looked exhausted. He slowly started moving money through shell companies. Small amounts at first, then larger amounts. By the time I figured it out, millions were gone. Dad frowned. So why didn't you go to the police? I tried. Daniel looked toward the SUV. He found out. Silence. He told me if I exposed him, he'd destroy all of us. Ethan crossed his arms. And you believed him? Daniel didn't answer. That was answer enough. Mom finally spoke. Richard knew everything about us. Bank accounts, schedules, schools, where the boys played soccer. Everything. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. He threatened us? Mom nodded. I didn't realize how serious it was until Ryan was born. Dad looked confused. What changed? Mom took a shaky breath. I found photographs. Nobody spoke. Pictures of Ethan sleeping, pictures of me at work, pictures of Daniel leaving meetings. My blood ran cold. Photographs, just like the ones Ethan found. Daniel closed his eyes. Richard liked collecting information. Outside, the SUV's interior light briefly flickered on. Someone was inside, watching us. Dad immediately walked to the window and closed the curtains. Everybody away from the windows. No one argued. Ethan looked at Daniel. So all these years, you thought Richard might come back? Daniel nodded. I knew he would eventually. Why now? Daniel looked at me. Because Ryan started asking questions. I stared at him. What? The day Ethan contacted me, someone else learned he'd found me. Dad's expression darkened. Richard. Daniel nodded. He'd been monitoring my communications. Ethan looked horrified. That's why you wanted information about Ryan. Daniel looked miserable. I was trying to figure out how much he already knew about your family. Dad let out a frustrated breath. You should have come to us. Daniel laughed softly. After 20 years, you would have slammed the door in my face. Dad didn't deny it. A loud crunch echoed outside. Gravel, a car door opening. Everyone froze. Another door, then another. Dad immediately grabbed his keys. We're leaving. No, Daniel said. Dad looked at him. No? Running is what got us here. Dad stared at him for several seconds. Then he nodded once. Fine. He looked at Ethan and me. Upstairs, both of you. This time, neither of us argued. Ethan and I hurried upstairs and crouched near the landing where we could still hear everything. A knock sounded downstairs. 3 slow knocks. Exactly like before. Nobody answered. Then a man's voice called out, Daniel? The voice sounded friendly. Normal, terrifyingly normal. I know you're in there. Silence. Emily, Mom gasped. You too, Thomas. Dad's face hardened. The voice continued. I think it's time we all stopped hiding. Daniel walked toward the front door. Dad grabbed his arm. Don't. Daniel gently pulled free. I've been hiding for 20 years. He opened the door. A man in his 60s stood on the porch. Gray hair, expensive jacket, calm smile. Richard Lawson. He looked like somebody's grandfather. He looked harmless. I instantly understood why everyone had been so afraid of him. People like Richard always looked harmless. Richard smiled. Daniel. Daniel said nothing. Richard looked past him. Emily. Mom looked sick. Then Richard's eyes moved through the room. They stopped on the staircase, on me. His smile widened. Ryan, he said warmly. Every instinct in my body screamed. I'd never met this man. Yet he said my name like we'd known each other forever. Nobody spoke. Richard sighed. I know this looks strange. Dad actually laughed. Strange? Richard ignored him. I came because there are things the boys deserve to know. Leave, Dad said. Richard shook his head. No. He looked directly at Ethan. Especially you. Ethan's expression changed. Fear. Real fear. What does that mean? I asked. Richard smiled sadly. Then he said the sentence that made the entire room go silent. Ethan, I'm your father. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Ethan just stared. Richard nodded slowly. Your mother already told you who I am. Mom burst into tears. Dad looked ready to collapse. Daniel closed his eyes, and Ethan looked like his entire world had just shattered. But before anyone could speak, Richard quietly added, and if Daniel ever told you otherwise. He looked directly at Daniel. He lied. Nobody spoke. Ethan looked like he'd been turned to stone. Richard stood calmly in the doorway, hands folded in front of him like he'd arrived for a neighborhood barbecue instead of detonating our entire family. Mom couldn't stop crying. Dad looked furious. Daniel looked defeated, and I had absolutely no idea what was true anymore. Ethan finally found his voice. You're lying, Richard sighed. I wish I was. You framed Daniel. Richard nodded. Yes. The room went silent. Even Daniel looked surprised. Richard glanced around. I've spent 20 years regretting that. Dad took a step forward. Regretting it didn't stop you from disappearing. Richard smiled sadly. No, it didn't. Ethan stared at him. Then why are you here? Richard looked directly at him. Because someone else is coming. A chill ran down my spine. Dad's expression changed instantly. What? Richard slowly reached into his coat. Dad immediately stepped in front of Mom. Richard pulled out a worn manila envelope and placed it on the kitchen table. I should have come years ago, he said quietly. But I was afraid. Afraid of what? I asked. Richard looked at Daniel. Of him. Everyone stared at Daniel. Daniel laughed in disbelief. You're serious? Richard nodded. I framed you because I discovered what you were doing. Daniel's face went pale. No. What are you talking about? Dad demanded. Richard looked exhausted. The money wasn't the worst part. Nobody moved. Richard swallowed. Daniel had become obsessed with keeping his family together. Daniel shook his head. Stop. You were tracking Emily before she ever left you. Stop. You hired private investigators. Richard, you had files on everyone. Daniel lunged forward. Dad immediately grabbed him. Enough. Daniel struggled for a second, then stopped. The room fell silent. Slowly, Daniel sat back down. He suddenly looked very old. Richard continued. When Emily left, Daniel couldn't accept it. Mom covered her face. He convinced himself she'd come back if he just waited long enough. I looked at Mom. She nodded through tears. It started small, she whispered. Flowers. Daniel looked away. Letters. More silence. Then photographs. My stomach dropped. The photographs. The ones Ethan found. The ones of me sleeping. No one had ever actually proven Daniel took them. We had only assumed. Richard looked at me. Ryan, the photographs Ethan found? He pointed at Daniel. He took them. I looked at Daniel. He didn't deny it. I felt sick. Why? Daniel's eyes filled with tears. I missed everything. That doesn't answer my question. I know. He looked at the floor. I told myself I was making sure you were safe. The room remained silent. Eventually, I realized I didn't know how to stop. Nobody spoke, because there wasn't really anything to say. Dad finally broke the silence. So why come here tonight, Richard? Richard looked down. Because Daniel contacted me 2 weeks ago. Daniel closed his eyes. He said he was finally taking his family back. Dad's face hardened. Richard continued. He asked for help. I looked at Daniel. You wanted him to help you take us? Daniel looked horrified. No. Richard sighed. Daniel wanted false passports. The room froze. Daniel finally spoke. I wasn't going to force anyone. No, Richard said quietly. You were just going to remove their ability to say no. Daniel looked devastated. I thought if we left together? He stopped. Mom shook her head. Oh, Daniel. For the first time, I truly understood. Daniel hadn't been evil. He'd been broken. And broken people could still be dangerous. Ethan suddenly stood. Everyone looked at him. He walked over to Daniel. For a second, I thought he was going to yell. Instead, he asked one question. When you found me 6 months ago, Daniel looked up. Did you actually want to know me? Daniel immediately answered. Yes. Ethan nodded slowly. Then why did you ask for Ryan's work schedule? Daniel couldn't answer. That was all Ethan needed. He stepped back. I think you loved the idea of us. Daniel started crying. Ethan didn't. I don't think you ever loved us as people. Silence filled the room. A few minutes later, Dad called the authorities. Nobody tried to stop him, not even Daniel. The investigation that followed uncovered decades of surveillance, financial crimes, and false identities. Richard eventually accepted responsibility for the fraud scheme. Daniel accepted responsibility for everything else. Neither man ever blamed the other again. Mom and Dad started therapy. So did Ethan and I. Turns out finding out your entire family history is basically a lie does weird things to you. Ethan eventually moved across the country. He needed distance. I stayed. Dad and I rebuilt our relationship slowly, one honest conversation at a time. A year later, Ethan came home for Thanksgiving. Late that night, we sat on the back porch together, just like when we were kids. I finally asked the question I'd been carrying since the beginning. Why did you send that text? Ethan smiled sadly. Because when I found Daniel, I thought Dad was the enemy. I nodded. I know. But after Dad came to see me that night, I realized something. What? Ethan looked toward the dark backyard. If Dad came home unexpectedly, it meant Daniel had already found us. I stared at him. So you told me to hide. He nodded. Until we knew who we could trust. We sat quietly for a long time. Then Ethan said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. The scariest part wasn't who was lying. It was realizing everyone was telling the truth, just from different parts of the story.